Marcus Chen had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 28, he worked as a junior analyst at a prestigious consulting firm in downtown Chicago, where he watched colleagues with half his intelligence climb the corporate ladder while he remained stuck in his cubicle. Every morning, he arrived at the office 15 minutes early, completed his work with meticulous precision, and left exactly at closing time. Yet somehow, he had become invisible to the very people who determined his future. The revelation came during a company retreat in the mountains of Colorado. Marcus found himself sitting alone at dinner, picking at his salmon while observing the dynamics around him. At the center table sat Victoria Sterling, the newest partner who had joined the firm just 18 months ago. She commanded the attention of every senior executive present, despite being younger than most of them. Her laugh carried across the dining room, and when she spoke, people leaned in to listen. Marcus studied her carefully, notebook discreetly hidden under his napkin as he jotted down observations. Victoria never interrupted anyone, yet she controlled every conversation. When the managing director shared a story about his sailing adventures, she asked questions that made him elaborate for 20 minutes. She remembered personal details about colleagues' families, their hobbies, their recent achievements. Most remarkably, she never seemed to try hard. Everything appeared effortless. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked to the hotel's business center and spent hours researching social psychology, influence, and power dynamics. He stumbled across works by Robert Cialdini, Dale Carnegie, and eventually, the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli. The Italian philosopher's insights into human nature and power weren't just historical curiosities. They were practical blueprints for navigating modern social hierarchies. Machiavelli had written that it was better to be both loved and feared, but if one had to choose, being feared was more reliable than being loved. However, Marcus realized that in the corporate world, there was a third option that Victoria had mastered, being respected and valued. She had achieved something that traditional Machiavellian thinking hadn't fully explored, the ability to make others feel powerful in her presence while simultaneously establishing her own dominance. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began implementing what he privately called the Machiavelli Project. His first experiment was simple: strategic listening. Instead of trying to impress his supervisor, David, with clever insights during their weekly meetings, Marcus began asking questions that made David elaborate on his own ideas. He discovered that David had once wanted to be a screenwriter and had written 3 unpublished novels. Marcus began referencing storytelling techniques when discussing project presentations, which made David light up with enthusiasm. The results were immediate and surprising. David started seeking Marcus's opinion on matters beyond his usual scope. Within a month, Marcus was invited to client meetings he had never been included in before. His colleagues began noticing this shift, though they couldn't quite articulate what had changed about Marcus's approach. Marcus's second experiment involved what he termed strategic vulnerability. He had noticed that Victoria occasionally shared calculated personal stories that made her seem more relatable while subtly demonstrating her expertise or connections. During a team meeting about a struggling project, Marcus mentioned that he had faced a similar challenge while organizing his college debate tournaments, where he had to coordinate conflicting personalities and tight deadlines. The story was true, but he had never mentioned his debate background before. Suddenly, he wasn't just the quiet analyst. He was someone with leadership experience and problem-solving skills. The transformation wasn't just professional. Marcus began applying these principles in his personal life as well. At his local coffee shop, instead of ordering quickly and leaving, he started remembering the baristas' names and asking about their studies or weekend plans. The result was not just better coffee service, but genuine connections that enriched his daily routine. The elderly woman who lived in his apartment building, Mrs. Patterson, had always been merely a polite neighbor. But when Marcus began asking about her garden and actually listening to her responses, she started sharing stories about her late husband's military service and her own career as a nurse. These conversations became the highlight of both their days. Marcus realized that Machiavelli's core insight wasn't about manipulation or deception. It was about understanding human nature deeply enough to interact with people in ways that satisfied their fundamental psychological needs. People wanted to feel heard, valued, and important. When you gave them these feelings authentically, they naturally wanted to reciprocate. As Marcus continued his research, he discovered that modern neuroscience had validated many of Machiavelli's observations about human behavior. The brain's reward systems responded strongly to feeling understood and appreciated. Mirror neurons made people unconsciously mimic the emotions and energy of those around them. The mere exposure effect meant that people developed preferences for things and people they encountered frequently, provided those encounters were positive. By the end of his first month of experimentation, Marcus had documented 12 specific behaviors that seemed to create what he called effortless power, the ability to influence and inspire others without appearing to try. These weren't manipulative tactics, but rather ways of interacting that brought out the best in both himself and others. The journey had only begun, but Marcus could already feel himself becoming someone different, someone who no longer needed to fade into the background. 3 months into his transformation, Marcus faced his first major test. The firm had landed its biggest client of the year, a technology startup seeking guidance on international expansion. The project would make or break several careers, and Marcus found himself assigned to a team led by James Morrison, a senior manager known for his aggressive tactics and territorial behavior. During their first team meeting, James made it clear that he expected total compliance from his subordinates. He interrupted team members mid-sentence, dismissed ideas without consideration, and seemed more interested in establishing dominance than in collaborative problem-solving. Marcus watched as his colleagues either retreated into silence or engaged in futile power struggles with James. Both responses played directly into James's hands, reinforcing his position as the alpha personality in the room. Marcus chose a different approach. When James finished outlining his vision for the project, Marcus nodded thoughtfully and said, "That framework covers the essential elements. I'm particularly interested in your insight about timing. That seems like it could be the make or break factor." He then asked a question about implementation that required James to elaborate on his thinking. Within minutes, James was speaking more thoughtfully and less aggressively, drawn into a genuine discussion rather than a dominance display. This technique, which Marcus had learned from studying Machiavelli's diplomatic strategies, involved redirecting rather than resisting aggressive energy. Instead of challenging James directly or submitting completely, Marcus had found a third path that allowed James to maintain his sense of authority while opening space for productive collaboration. The other team members noticed the shift in dynamics and began contributing more freely to the discussion. The real breakthrough came when Marcus applied what he called the strategic praise principle. Rather than flattering James's ego with generic compliments, Marcus began highlighting specific insights that James contributed, particularly those that demonstrated deep thinking or creativity. When James suggested an innovative approach to market research, Marcus said that methodology could become a case study for how to adapt traditional research to emerging markets. The praise was specific, professional, and positioned James as an expert rather than just a boss. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed that James began seeking his input on important decisions. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was consistent. James started introducing Marcus to senior clients as our strategic thinker and included him in planning sessions that typically involved only senior staff. Marcus had achieved something remarkable. He had turned a potential adversary into an advocate without compromising his own integrity or authenticity. The success with James taught Marcus a crucial lesson about what Machiavelli had understood about power dynamics. True influence came not from overpowering others, but from making them feel more powerful themselves. When people felt enhanced by your presence rather than diminished, they naturally wanted to keep you close to them. This principle worked because it aligned with fundamental human psychology. Everyone wanted to feel competent, valued, and significant. Marcus began experimenting with this approach across different relationships. With Sarah, the brilliant but insecure junior associate, he started asking for her opinion on technical matters where she excelled. Instead of offering his own solutions immediately, he would say things like, "You've worked with similar data sets before, what patterns are you noticing?" Sarah began speaking up more confidently in meetings and started proactively bringing insights to the team. With Robert, the veteran consultant who seemed bitter about younger colleagues' rapid advancement, Marcus took a different approach. He began asking Robert about the evolution of consulting practices over his career, genuinely interested in understanding how the industry had changed. These conversations revealed Robert's deep institutional knowledge and wisdom gained from decades of experience. Robert began sharing war stories and strategic insights that proved invaluable to the team's work. More importantly, Robert's attitude toward the younger team members softened, as he felt valued for his expertise rather than sidelined by his age. Marcus documented these interactions carefully, noting which approaches worked with different personality types and in various contexts. He discovered that the key was authentic interest rather than calculated flattery. When his attention and appreciation were genuine, people responded positively. When he forced it or used techniques mechanically, the results were awkward and counterproductive. The most significant development came when Victoria Sterling noticed Marcus's growing influence within the organization. During a firm-wide meeting, she approached him afterward and said, "You've been doing some interesting work on the Morrison project. I'd like to hear your thoughts on team dynamics." This wasn't a casual comment. Victoria was known for her ability to spot rising talent and emerging leaders. Their conversation revealed that Victoria had been observing the same principles Marcus was learning, though she had developed them intuitively rather than through systematic study. She described her approach as collaborative leadership, the ability to guide without controlling, to influence without manipulating. She had noticed Marcus's skillful handling of James and his positive impact on team morale. Victoria became an informal mentor, sharing insights about organizational politics and human psychology that accelerated Marcus's development. She taught him about the importance of timing and communication, the power of strategic silence, and the art of making difficult conversations feel collaborative rather than confrontational. Most importantly, she helped him understand that authenticity was not the enemy of strategy. In fact, the most effective influence came from aligning strategic thinking with genuine care for others' success and well-being. As Marcus reflected on his progress, he realized that he had discovered something profound about human nature. People were not motivated primarily by fear or greed, as traditional power dynamics suggested, but by the desire to feel valued, understood, and significant. When you helped others satisfy these deeper psychological needs, they naturally reciprocated with trust, respect, and loyalty. This created a positive cycle where everyone benefited, precisely the kind of sustainable influence that Machiavelli had advocated for wise leaders. The project with James's team exceeded all expectations, and Marcus found himself being considered for promotion ahead of schedule. But more importantly, he had gained something far more valuable than career advancement. He had learned how to build genuine influence based on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. The transformation was becoming effortless, natural, and deeply satisfying. 6 months after beginning his transformation, Marcus encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned. The firm was bidding for a contract with Meridian Industries, a family-owned manufacturing company transitioning to sustainable practices. The client meeting would include 3 generations of the founding family, each with different priorities, communication styles, and views on the company's future direction. Marcus spent weeks preparing, but not in the traditional sense of memorizing presentation slides and financial projections. Instead, he researched each family member's background, their professional achievements, personal interests, and public statements about the company's mission. He studied family business dynamics, generational psychology, and the specific challenges facing manufacturing companies in the sustainability transition. The patriarch, Edward Meridian, was a self-made entrepreneur who had built the company from a small machine shop into a regional powerhouse. His son, David, served as current CEO and was focused on operational efficiency and market expansion. David's daughter, Lisa, recently graduated from MIT with an environmental engineering degree, had been appointed as head of sustainability and represented the company's future direction. The morning of the presentation, Marcus noticed something crucial. The other consulting teams were preparing to deliver standard corporate pitches focused on cost savings and process optimization. They were treating this as a typical business proposal rather than understanding the complex family dynamics and emotional investments at stake. When Marcus's team entered the conference room, he immediately observed the seating arrangement and body language. Edward sat at the head of the table, commanding the space with the natural authority of someone who had built everything around him. David sat to his right, constantly checking his phone and tablet, clearly operating under tremendous pressure to prove himself worthy of his inherited position. Lisa sat slightly apart from both men, her environmental reports and sustainability frameworks spread in front of her like a barrier. James Morrison began the presentation with his usual confident energy, launching into market analysis and competitive positioning. Marcus watched as Edward nodded politely but remained disengaged. David continued multitasking, and Lisa appeared increasingly frustrated with the focus on traditional business metrics rather than environmental impact. When James reached the section on implementation strategy, Marcus intervened with a carefully planned question. "Mr. Meridian," he addressed the patriarch directly, "you've built something remarkable here, a company that's survived and thrived for over 4 decades. As we think about the next phase of growth, I'm curious about your perspective on balancing innovation with the values that made Meridian successful in the first place." The room's energy shifted immediately. Edward straightened in his chair, his eyes focusing intently on Marcus. This wasn't another consultant trying to impress him with spreadsheets. This was someone who understood that the company represented more than financial assets. Edward began speaking about his vision for Meridian's legacy, the importance of family values in business, and his hopes for future generations. Marcus listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in Edward's philosophy rather than just his business decisions. When Edward mentioned his concern about maintaining quality standards during rapid expansion, Marcus nodded thoughtfully and said, "That reminds me of something Toyota faced during their international growth. They found that their success depended on preserving their core principles while adapting their methods. It sounds like you're navigating a similar challenge." The comparison resonated powerfully with Edward, who began sharing more personal insights about his leadership philosophy and concerns about the company's future. David stopped checking his devices and started engaging in the conversation, adding his own perspectives on operational challenges and market opportunities. Lisa leaned forward, interested in the discussion of values-based business decisions. Marcus then employed what he had learned about strategic inclusion. Rather than dominating the conversation, he began weaving in questions that highlighted each family member's expertise. To David, he said, "Your operational experience gives you a unique perspective on implementation challenges. What factors do you think are most critical for successful change management in a company with Meridian's culture?" David's response revealed sophisticated thinking about organizational psychology and change leadership that impressed both his father and daughter. Marcus had created space for David to demonstrate his competence rather than just his position in the family hierarchy. To Lisa, Marcus asked, "Your environmental engineering background brings a technical depth that most sustainability consultants lack. How do you see the intersection between environmental responsibility and operational efficiency in manufacturing?" Lisa's eyes lit up as she launched into a detailed explanation of sustainable manufacturing processes that could actually reduce costs while improving environmental impact. For the first time in the meeting, all 3 family members were fully engaged in the same conversation, each contributing their unique expertise to a shared vision. Marcus had orchestrated something remarkable. He had transformed a traditional vendor presentation into a collaborative planning session where the family members were working together rather than defending their individual territories. The consulting team was no longer pitching services. They were facilitating a family business strategy session. The breakthrough moment came when Edward turned to his son and daughter and said, "This is exactly the kind of thinking we need. Someone who understands that our business is about more than numbers." David nodded in agreement, adding, "And someone who can help us integrate all our perspectives instead of choosing between them." Lisa smiled and said, "Finally, consultants who get that sustainability isn't just a department, it's a business philosophy." After the meeting, James was amazed by what had transpired. "How did you know to approach them that way?" he asked. Marcus explained his research process and the psychological principles behind his strategy. He had recognized that this wasn't really about consulting services. It was about helping a family navigate generational transition while maintaining their shared values and vision. The contract signing ceremony took place 3 weeks later, but the real victory for Marcus wasn't the business success. It was the realization that he had internalized a fundamental truth about human influence. When you helped people become the best versions of themselves, when you created space for their expertise and wisdom to emerge, when you aligned your success with their success, influence became effortless and natural. Marcus had learned to see social interactions not as competitions to be won, but as collaborative opportunities to create mutual value. This shift in perspective had transformed him from someone who struggled to be noticed into someone whose presence naturally elevated every room he entered. The power was becoming effortless because it was authentic, sustainable, and genuinely beneficial for everyone involved. 1 year after beginning his transformation, Marcus faced an unexpected challenge that would reveal how deeply his new approach had taken root. The consulting firm was restructuring, and rumors of layoffs had created an atmosphere of fear and competition among the staff. Colleagues who had previously collaborated openly now guarded information and undermined each other's projects in desperate attempts to prove their indispensability. Marcus found himself in a unique position. His growing reputation and strong relationships with both clients and senior management meant he was likely safe from layoffs. However, several of his colleagues, people who had become genuine friends during his journey, faced uncertain futures. The old Marcus might have focused solely on protecting his own position, but the person he had become couldn't ignore the suffering around him. The situation came to a head during a team meeting where tensions exploded between Sarah and Tom, two junior analysts competing for what they believed was a single remaining position. Sarah accused Tom of stealing her ideas for a client proposal, while Tom claimed Sarah was spreading rumors about his performance. The argument escalated until both were shouting, their professional facades completely shattered by stress and fear. Most of the team sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond. James Morrison, typically decisive in crisis situations, seemed paralyzed by the interpersonal nature of the conflict. Marcus realized this was a moment that would define not just the immediate situation, but the entire culture of their workplace going forward. He employed a technique he had learned from studying conflict resolution and Machiavellian diplomacy, redirecting emotional energy toward shared interests rather than opposing positions. "Sarah, Tom," he said calmly, waiting until both turned their attention to him. "You're both brilliant analysts and you're both scared. That's understandable, we all are. But right now, you're fighting each other instead of fighting the real problem." The room fell silent. Marcus continued, "The real problem isn't that there's only room for one of you. The real problem is that we're not demonstrating why this team is too valuable to break up. We're showing management exactly what they expect. That pressure makes us turn on each other instead of working together." He then did something unexpected. Instead of proposing a solution, he asked a question that reframed the entire situation. "What if we used this crisis to prove that this team can deliver extraordinary results under pressure? What if we showed them that laying off anyone from this group would be a strategic mistake?" The question shifted the entire dynamic. Instead of competing against each other, Sarah and Tom began thinking about how to compete against the external threat to their team. Marcus facilitated a discussion where team members identified their individual strengths and how those strengths could complement each other in delivering exceptional value to clients. Sarah's analytical skills and Tom's creative problem-solving abilities, which had seemed like competing assets, were reframed as complementary capabilities that made the team stronger. Marcus helped them see that their different approaches to the same problems actually provided clients with more comprehensive solutions than either could deliver alone. Over the next month, Marcus worked behind the scenes to implement what he privately called collective influence strategy. Instead of protecting only his own position, he actively promoted his colleagues' successes to senior management. When Sarah developed an innovative financial modeling approach, Marcus made sure it was highlighted in his reports to Victoria Sterling. When Tom's creative presentation style led to a client breakthrough, Marcus ensured that James Morrison understood Tom's contribution to the project's success. This approach required Marcus to suppress his ego and any competitive instincts. Traditional career advice suggested that sharing credit was naive and potentially self-destructive. But Marcus had learned that true influence came from making others successful, and that sustainable power was built on a foundation of mutual benefit rather than individual achievement. The strategy worked beyond Marcus's expectations. As his colleagues' reputations improved, they naturally became more collaborative and supportive. Sarah began sharing analytical techniques that helped the entire team deliver higher quality work. Tom started offering creative insights that elevated everyone's presentations. The team's collective performance improved dramatically, making them indispensable to the firm's operations. Victoria Sterling noticed the transformation and asked Marcus to explain how he had managed to maintain team morale and productivity during such a stressful period. Marcus shared his approach, emphasizing the psychological principles behind collective success and mutual support. Victoria was impressed not just by the results, but by the sophisticated understanding of human motivation that Marcus had developed. The conversation led to an unexpected opportunity. Victoria was launching a new division focused on organizational psychology and change management, and she offered Marcus a leadership role in developing these services for clients. The position would mean a significant promotion and the chance to apply his insights about human influence on a much larger scale. Marcus accepted the role, but insisted on bringing his entire team with him. He had learned that individual success built on others' failure was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. True power came from lifting others up, not from climbing over them. This decision reinforced his reputation as someone who could be trusted with greater responsibility, because he used influence for collective benefit rather than personal gain. The new division's first major project involved helping a Fortune 500 company navigate a merger that was failing due to cultural conflicts between the two organizations. Marcus applied everything he had learned about reading group dynamics, facilitating difficult conversations, and finding shared interests beneath opposing positions. The project's success led to additional contracts and established Marcus as a recognized expert in organizational psychology. As Marcus reflected on his journey, he realized that the most profound changes hadn't been in his external circumstances, but in his fundamental approach to human relationships. He had stopped seeing other people as obstacles or competitors and started seeing them as collaborators in creating mutual success. This shift had made influence feel natural and effortless because it aligned with people's deepest psychological needs for recognition, appreciation, and significance. The 12 habits he had identified weren't manipulation techniques, but rather authentic ways of interacting that brought out the best in both himself and others. Strategic listening helped people feel heard and valued. Genuine curiosity about others' expertise made them feel respected and important. Collaborative problem-solving created shared victories that strengthened relationships. Generous recognition of others' contributions built loyalty and trust. Marcus had discovered that Machiavelli's core insight wasn't about deception or ruthless competition. It was about understanding human nature deeply enough to create win-win scenarios where everyone's interests were served. When you helped others achieve their goals, they naturally wanted to help you achieve yours. When you made others feel powerful and significant, they associated those positive feelings with your presence and sought out your company. The transformation had become effortless because it was no longer a performance or strategy. It had become Marcus's authentic way of being in the world. The habits that had once required conscious effort now felt natural and automatic, like any other skill that had been practiced to mastery. 2 years after his transformation began, Marcus stood before an audience of 300 executives at the International Leadership Conference, delivering a keynote presentation on the psychology of effortless influence. The journey from invisible analyst to recognized thought leader had been remarkable, but the real transformation ran much deeper than professional success. The presentation drew from extensive research Marcus had conducted with his team, analyzing hundreds of successful leaders across industries to identify the common patterns that created sustainable influence. They had discovered that while traditional power often relied on position, resources, or coercion, effortless power emerged from a completely different source: the ability to consistently enhance others' sense of competence, autonomy, and purpose. Marcus shared the story of Elena Rodriguez, a factory supervisor who had transformed one of the most dysfunctional manufacturing teams in her company into their highest-performing unit. Elena didn't have special authority or resources. She simply made every team member feel valued and capable. She remembered workers' names, asked about their families, and genuinely listened to their suggestions for improving processes. When problems arose, she framed them as collaborative challenges rather than individual failures. The result was a team that consistently exceeded production targets while maintaining the highest safety record in the company. The audience was captivated by these real-world examples, but Marcus knew that stories alone wouldn't create lasting change. He had learned that sustainable transformation required understanding the psychological mechanisms that made these approaches effective. He explained how mirror neurons caused people to unconsciously adopt the emotional state of those around them, meaning that calm, confident energy naturally spread to others. He described how the brain's reward systems responded more strongly to unexpected recognition than to predictable praise, making strategic appreciation far more powerful than generic flattery. During the question and answer session, a senior executive asked the question Marcus had been anticipating. "This all sounds idealistic, But what about situations where you're dealing with genuinely difficult people? How do you maintain this collaborative approach when others are playing by different rules? Marcus smiled, remembering his own early doubts about these principles. The most sophisticated insight from Machiavelli's work isn't about being nice to nice people, he replied. It's about understanding that even difficult people have underlying motivations and needs. When you can identify what someone really wants, respect, security, recognition, control, you can often find ways to satisfy those needs while achieving your own objectives. He shared the story of his recent work with a technology CEO who was known for his volatile temper and intimidating management style. Rather than confronting this behavior directly, Marcus had spent time understanding the pressures and insecurities driving it. The CEO was facing investor scrutiny, competitive threats, and internal challenges that made him feel constantly under attack. Marcus helped him see that his aggressive approach was actually creating many of the problems he was trying to solve. Through careful questioning and strategic conversations, Marcus guided the CEO to discover that his team's performance improved dramatically when they felt supported rather than threatened. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The CEO began asking for input instead of demanding compliance, and his company's culture shifted from fear-based to innovation-focused. Employee satisfaction scores improved, turnover decreased, and financial performance reached record levels. The key insight, Marcus explained, was that sustainable influence required patience and authentic interest in others' well-being. Quick manipulation tactics might produce short-term results, but they inevitably backfired when people realized they were being used. True influence came from aligning your success with others' success, creating positive-sum scenarios where everyone benefited. After the presentation, Marcus was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an organizational psychologist from Harvard Business School who had been studying similar phenomena. She had documented how leaders with relational intelligence, the ability to understand and respond to others' psychological needs, consistently outperformed those who relied on traditional authority-based approaches. Her research confirmed what Marcus had discovered through practical experience, that human beings were wired for collaboration and reciprocity, and that tapping into these natural tendencies was far more effective than fighting against them. Their conversation led to a research partnership that would further validate and refine Marcus's insights. They began conducting longitudinal studies, tracking the career trajectories of leaders who employed different influence strategies. The preliminary results were striking. Leaders who focused on mutual benefit and genuine relationship building not only achieved better short-term results, but also maintained their influence longer and faced fewer setbacks from interpersonal conflicts. As Marcus returned to his hotel that evening, he reflected on how completely his worldview had changed. The young analyst who had felt powerless and invisible now understood that true power had never been about dominating others or achieving success at their expense. Real influence came from understanding human psychology deeply enough to create interactions that left everyone feeling more capable, more valued, and more optimistic about their shared future. The 12 habits he had identified and refined over 2 years weren't secret techniques or manipulative tactics. They were simply ways of interacting that honored the fundamental human needs for recognition, respect, and connection. When you listened with genuine curiosity, people felt heard and valued. When you asked questions that helped others think through problems, they felt intelligent and capable. When you shared credit generously, others associated their success with your presence and sought out your collaboration. Marcus had also learned that this approach required ongoing self-awareness and personal growth. The habits only worked when they came from a place of authenticity and genuine care for others. When he tried to use them manipulatively, or when his own ego got in the way, the results were awkward and counterproductive. True influence required constantly working on yourself, managing your own emotions and motivations, and staying focused on creating value for others rather than extracting value from them. The journey had taught him that Machiavelli's most profound insight wasn't about the mechanics of power, but about the psychology of human relationships. People naturally wanted to cooperate, to contribute, to feel significant and valued. When leaders created environments where these natural tendencies could flourish, extraordinary results followed almost effortlessly. As Marcus looked toward the future, he saw endless opportunities to apply and share these insights. The world was full of conflicts that stemmed from misunderstanding, competitions that could become collaborations, and zero-sum thinking that prevented people from recognizing their shared interests. His mission had evolved from advancing his own career to helping others discover their own capacity for positive influence. The transformation that had begun with one invisible analyst's desire for recognition had rippled outward to impact hundreds of people across multiple organizations. Marcus had learned that this was how real change happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through countless small interactions where people left feeling a little more valued, a little more capable, and a little more hopeful about what they could accomplish together. The power had indeed become effortless, not because it required no effort, but because it flowed naturally from understanding and honoring the deepest truths about human nature. When you helped others become their best selves, influence stopped being something you wielded and became something you embodied.